In the early 1900s, there were many families who came here as pioneers. They brought with them a variety of backgrounds and skill sets and talents, and they became committed to the community. Through their time and their efforts, they helped Vero Beach grow. When we think of families that are legacy families, we think of people like the Schumanns, who came here from Indiana in 1926, and they had an impact and influence on shaping the community.
I'm John Schumann, former publisher of the Press Journal. My parents were both from Indiana. They met at Indiana University, and my father was working for his father in a newspaper that my grandfather owned in Frankfort, Indiana. And they decided that Florida was booming at the time. This was 1926. So my mother, father, and grandfather came to Florida and looked for a town where they might start a newspaper, and they settled on Vero Beach. The first memory I have, I believe it's the first, probably an odd one, was when I was 4. And it was late December, almost Christmas. And I was fascinated by airplanes. And one day I saw an airplane headed for the Vero Beach Airport. And I became convinced that it was Santa Claus, that Santa Claus was coming not in a sleigh, but in that red airplane. And I keep pestering my mother about it, and she decided to call P.O. Clements, who was the assistant manager of the airport and assistant manager of Eastern Airlines. And she got him on the phone, told him what I was interested in, and then they handed me the phone, and P.O. confirmed it. It was indeed Santa Claus. And I was just delighted to learn that, and I guess that contributed to a lifelong interest in airplanes. And I think that's one of the things that could not happen in a big city, just in a small town. So that would be probably my first memory that I am aware of. Well, it was different. Vero Beach was a different town, much smaller, of course. I think less than 3,000 when I was growing up. And two things that stood out were the heat and the mosquitoes. There was no air conditioning, and there was no mosquito control that amounted to much. Later, of course, the mosquito control district was established, I think by Alex McWilliams Sr., and we began to get the mosquitoes under control, but they were really bad because you couldn't keep them out by air conditioning, and they seemed to get through the screens somehow, particularly sandflies. So I have the greatest respect for the resilience and fortitude of the people who came here in those days when we did not have air conditioning and the mosquitoes were so bad. Of course, many of the streets were unpaved. I would say most of them. And the buildings were, many of them, more frame buildings. I think they had a bad fire down in Vero, but that was before I came along. But there was a feeling of community. You knew most of the people or knew who they were. In fact, if you saw a car coming down the road, you knew right away who it was. so you knew whether to wave or not. Probably somebody you knew. It was that small a town. We don't try to do that anymore. The airport was a small place, but a fascinating place. My family moved from 42nd Avenue in 1936 to a house in McCanch Park, which is only a house probably less than a mile from the airport. So I was able to ride my bicycle out to the airport, see the airliner come in, and enjoyed that. The house was where De Leon Avenue meets Victory Boulevard. Victory Boulevard, incidentally, got its name during World War II when the Navy base was at the airport, and they renamed it the Victory Boulevard. But it's a two-story house, and it was built by William Hensick and Sons. I think the house cost $8,000 in 1936, and that's where I grew up. Well, I didn't watch television, and I didn't have a cell phone because neither had been invented. But we found other things to do. Some of them we got in trouble for, but I won't go into that. We played a lot of sports, football, baseball. Some was well organized, some just for friends. People would get together on a Saturday, boys, and we would play. We liked model airplanes, built the airplanes at that time and flew them. Some of us also had whizzer motorbikes, a motorbike with a 2.5 horsepower engine on it. And we had a whizzer club, and we also had members that had a Cushman motor scooter, so we had transportation. We could ride all over town and see things. So those are a lot of what we did, spending time building models, playing sports, some reading. I did deliver newspapers at one time. That was through the Navy base. They allowed my father to come and bring me into the Navy base, where I sold the weekly newspaper for a nickel. And I went to the officers' quarters and sold the newspapers there. Later, I did deliver newspapers in a sense, because when I came back to work on the newspaper full time, we began to buy vending machines that could be placed all around town, at grocery stores, the post office, for instance. And so it was my job to load my station wagon with stacks of newspapers after the paper came out on Wednesday evening, and drive around and put the papers in the vending machines. I continued to do that delivery long after I was selling advertising for the newspaper. In a small paper, one does many different jobs, so those are a couple of my jobs at the time. I first started working at the paper when I was in high school, probably 17. My first job was actually the janitor, and then later I would help around the press, mostly clean up the waste paper. Then in high school I began to write sports, and I went to college to study journalism at Mercer University. I worked at the newspaper in the summertime, filling in for various people while they were on vacation. And then I began to work full-time at the paper in 1956 after getting out of the Army, where I had served for 2 years. And I stayed in the job there for 40 years until I retired in 1996. The paper was located downtown. The newspaper staff had grown to the size that we had trouble finding parking, so in 1969 we moved to the location on US 1. My father had purchased a lot down there many years before, and it was almost a whole city block. So we were able to build a new building in '69 and had plenty of parking, both for our staff and for visitors to the newspaper. That lot at the time he purchased had a residence on US 1, and behind it was the remains of an orange grove which had been interspersed with pecan trees. And he was quite visionary. He realized someday that would be useful property, and we tried to make it so. Well, I remember a huge change in the newspaper. One thing I remember from the very early days was how the elections were reported. We didn't have radio, so that's when we were downtown, where Ironside Press most recently was. The editor, Harry J. Schultz, got a big blackboard, and on election day, we would set up the blackboard in a vacant lot adjacent to the Press Journal. There was nothing there, just weeds. And Harry set that up, lined it down with precincts and then the candidates, and he sent reporters and volunteers to the various precinct locations, and they would call in the results. When that precinct got a result, and Harry would write it down on this big blackboard. And it was a very popular thing. People lined the streets in both sides with cars and then filled the street standing there watching breathlessly for the next report to come in. So that's so different from what it is today, but it was an exciting event, and it is a vivid memory I have of early days. Back in the days when the Press Journal started, we used letterpress, which means that all the type is set in lead and then in lettered, molded. So we did that for quite a time, and just before '96, offset printing had come in, and we decided that we would make the change to offset and build a new building at the same time. So that's when we moved down to the US 1 location. The old press we had would print 3,000 papers an hour, and the new press we purchased would print 20,000 papers an hour. So it was a huge change in speed, and the offset typesetting was much faster. A good line type operator in the old type of printing could set about 8 lines of type, that is a column wide, a minute. And later the offset printing typesetter we got would set 20,000 lines a minute, just an amazing difference in speed. Later we got one typesetter that's at 45,000 lines a minute, and eventually we had one that's at 1,000 lines a minute with type and pictures all the way across the page. So it was exciting technically. We used to put newspaper sections together, the A, B, C. It was all done by hand. Stuffing, they call it, stuff one into the other. When we had a small staff, as we printed the paper, we would set up tables, and all of us, editor included, would stand there stuffing these papers together. And I mentally tried to invent some machine that would do that for me. Somebody else did it for us, and eventually we got a machine that would put those papers together. That just very rapidly, and it would put several sections together at one time. Another example of how big improvements were made in the mechanics of it. I may have mentioned finally we had a press that would print papers at the rate of 45,000 an hour. And that's the last press that we used. Of course, it was exciting times when we finally moved from once a week publication, which the newspaper had been for years and years, to twice a week. I think that was in the early 70s. And then we went to 3 times a week, at that time printing all local news 3 times a week. And that was a very popular paper. Finally, around 72, I believe it was, we went to what they called daily, which was a 5-day daily. We skipped Saturday and Monday. And then we went to 4 days or 6 days a week, and finally to 7. So that transition, getting the wire service, going to computers instead of typewriters, all of that change kept things very interesting. And I always found it a fascinating business because it is many things. It's a news gathering business, it's an advertising sales business, it's a production business as you produce the paper, and it's a distribution business as you distribute the newspaper in many ways to people around the town and around the country. So it always stayed interesting. Well, I've enjoyed being able to travel, which my wife Kathy and I have traveled to a number of countries around the world. And we enjoy cars. We've gotten into car collections, some of which you see here. And we took driving courses and ended up joining organizations that allowed us to drive on tracks around the country, racetracks, Palm Beach International, Sebring, Daytona, Watkins Glen, New York, Pocono, Pennsylvania. So those driving years were really very interesting. I've continued to enjoy flying as we live at the Indian River Aerodrome. I have a little airplane in the backyard, so that has been a good hobby. And I have spent 11 years on the board of directors at McKee Botanical Garden, which has been a rewarding experience because I think that's one of the gems in our community. And one day I was riding on a golf cart with the director of the garden, Christine Hobart. We'd inspected a new parking lot that was being made, and I looked around and the garden was just so beautiful. and I was into cars. I said, you know, I think this would be a beautiful place for a car show, hoping she would take it and run with it. But instead, I ended up, before I knew it, I was in charge of a car show. And I have done that for the past 15 years. Every February, we have a car show with a different theme. So that alone has kept me somewhat occupied, because there's something to do in preparation for the car show every month. So that's what I do. The World War II years were certainly exciting for a young teenager, with all the airplanes flying around and the base down at Fort Pierce had the frogmen, we called them at the time, and occasionally getting to go out to the base. I remember going out with Norman Hensick and his father, Norman Hensick, who built many of the buildings on the air base, one night, and the whole ramp was occupied by F-6F Hellcat night fighters, and they were warming up, so there was this sound just penetrating everywhere, planes coming and going. It was a very exciting time for a young boy to grow up. Yes, there were people who went out and actually did patrolling in boats. I think Rhodey Johnson has written a good book about that, where they actually spotted a submarine. And the street lights, I recall, were all painted black on the east side so that the town would not present a glow on the horizon, against which a silhouette of a submarine or of a freight boat could be seen by a submarine. They also painted the top part of automobile headlights black, so they wouldn't contribute to any glow. And of course we had rationing. Sugar was rationed, other foods rationed, gasoline was rationed, tires were rationed. So it was a different life. Many of the young men were gone from town in the service, but there are many other young men who came in the service here at the Navy base, and they would have dances down at what is now the Heritage Center, and many of the young girls in Vero Beach met their future husbands at those events. Wally Schism would be one member, Fuzzy Cox. I'm sure there are many others. And many of those Navy people later came to Vero Beach and settled and had businesses here. So the war years had their excitement. You were always hearing things on the radio and finding headlines in the newspaper that were exciting. And we like to ride our motorbikes out to the airport and stand at the fence and watch the airplanes. That was an exciting thing to do also. Well, I might say that the most significant has been the great development on the beach side, the barrier island. We used to only call it the beach. Now it's more popularly called the barrier island, but very few people lived there because the mosquitoes and sandflies were intense, and the heat, of course, was bad. So now with it certainly developed into a beautiful housing area, that has been a tremendous change. We also got a change when Piper moved here in 1957, I think, set up their development center, and then a year or two later, a factory, so that we now have this very welcome Piper factory here in Vero Beach. I think a change has occurred, not for the better, but to the citrus industry, where citrus was king. And then the disease came along and it's just been insurmountable. So what was once a major source of income here in the county is not at the level that it once was. We don't have near the number of people employed in it, nor the number of packing houses in operation. I imagine the population has changed too. More of an elderly, retired population. And in the early days, you had to be pretty young, I think, to survive the heat and mosquitoes. So that has probably been a change also. Education-wise, we have schools all over the county, which at one time we did not. There have been many changes, large and small, that have occurred.
In Vero Beach today, we're considering many things about how our community is changing and what impacts that has, how we can change to help the community in the future and help it grow. You have to look back in order to know what you're looking forward to. And interviews like this with John Schumann remind us about where we have come from and help us as we shape the future for Vero Beach.